Hello, my name is Connor Cullen, and in this review I'm going to be comparing the Nikon 17 to 35mm stop 2.8 lens with the newer Nikon 16 to 35mm f-stop 4 lens. Now what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to talk about the build quality of both these lenses and compare my first thoughts about both these lenses. Then I'm also going to go over to screen flow, and we're going to compare image quality between the two lenses. And then finally, I'm going to talk about in the field with these lenses, in my opinions on which lens to get, stuff like that. Now, first thing I want to talk about is the look and feel of the lenses and compare that between them. Now, the 17 to 35mm isn't quite as sleek as the 16 to 35mm lens. The 16 to 35mm doesn't have that many buttons and is very sleek looking, very professional looking. The 17 to 35mm is a little more cluttered, not quite as sleek looking, and of course it does have the old aperture ring on the edge here that G lenses don't have anymore. But other than that, the build quality of these lenses is similar, but the older 17 to 35mm actually does feel more solid, feels a lot more durable. That's the way it was with most older Nikon lenses. The Pro lenses from a while back actually feel a lot more solid and more like they could take more of a hit from nature and stuff like that. Whereas the 16 to 35mm feels a little more plasticky, a little bit more cheaply made, although I'm sure it is also very solid as well. Another thing that's interesting about these lenses is the size comparison. You'd think that the 17 to 35mm would weigh a lot more, but actually it weighs about the same as the 16 to 35mm, and the 16 to 35mm is actually taller and longer than the 17 to 35mm lens. And that's even with the 17 to 35mm lens having a full stop faster. So that's a little bit of a disadvantage for this lens. You'd think it'd be a little bit smaller since it's a stop slower, but it's still pretty large and they're both about the same size. Other than that, the real difference, the significant difference between these two lenses is the fact that the 16 to 35mm does have VR, which is somewhat useful, but personally, if you're into landscape photography and stuff like that, you're going to use a tripod anyway, and it is an ultra-wide angle lens, so VR really isn't necessary for these lenses, but it can be useful if you happen to find yourself in situations that are low light and you have to handhold the camera to take pictures with. Finally, the last significant difference is, like I said earlier, the difference in f-stop. 17 to 35mm has an f-stop of 2.8, and the 16 to 35 an f-stop of 4. That's a little bit of a shame that the 16 to 35 doesn't have a full f-stop of 2.8, but it's not necessarily that big of a deal because this lens is really built for landscape photographers anyway. But the 17 to 35mm is a full stop faster. So, from first thoughts, you think that this would work well for wide angle, low light photography, which it does. It does go full stop faster, so we can get quicker images in low light situations. But now what we're going to do is we're going to go over to screen flow. We're going to compare image quality between these two lenses. Alright, now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the comparison between the 16 to 35mm and 17 to 35mm lenses. Now right here, this first pick is the 17 to 35mm picture, all the way open at f-stop 2.8 and at 17mm. What we're going to do is we're going to take that picture and we're going to compare it to the 16 to 35mm results right here, wide open at f-stop 4. Now, of course, I'm comparing these at f-stop 2.8 and f-stop 4, so of course the 16 to 35mm is going to be sharper. But after that, I'm going to be comparing similar f-stops to f-stop 4. So, starting here with the 17 to 35mm lens. Here we are at f-stop 2.8. We're going to look at center sharpness. And then here's 16mm at f-stop 2.8 on the 16 to 35mm lens. Now, as you can see, it's really not that big of a difference, not as much as I can see. The 17 to 35mm might only be slightly softer, and this is wide open at 2.8, whereas the 16 to 14mm is at f-stop of 4.
Now we're going to take a look at the corners though, and this is where you start to see that huge dramatic difference. Over here you can see how soft it gets. It's sharp right here and then it transitions to very soft, and it happens on both sides of the frame. Now take a look at the 16 to 35 millimeter results. You can see just how much sharper it is, and yes, it is at f-stop 4, but we're going to compare this now to the 17 to 35 millimeter at f-stop 4. Here's the 17 to 35 millimeter at f-stop 4. As you can see, it's better than the 2.8, but it's still, in those corners, very soft. All around the corners. Here it's soft too, and up here especially you can see that softness. Whereas the 16 to 35 millimeter, you can see how much sharper, how crisp that is. It's just a huge dramatic difference between them. Especially if you look at that building, you can see how much crisper the 16 to 35 millimeter lens is. Now we're going to stop down to f-stop 5.6 with the 17 to 35 millimeter lens. As you can see, that makes a dramatic difference, but even then it still can't match the performance, in my opinion, of the 16 to 35 millimeter lens wide open at f-stop 4. Here's the 16 to 35 millimeter lens at f-stop 4 still, and there's the 17 to 35 millimeter at f-stop 5.6. Now at f-stop 8, it's finally matched the sharpness of the 16 to 35 millimeter wide open. So as you can see, the 16 to 35 millimeter is a much better performer, especially in terms of corner sharpness and around the edges. The 16 to 35 millimeter lens wide open is as sharp as the 17 to 35 millimeter stop down to f-stop 8. So you can see the dramatic improvement that Nikon has made to their lenses. And that alone is enough to easily rule out the 17 to 35 millimeter for any sort of landscape photography, and pretty much low-light photography too, because as you can see, the 16 to 35 millimeter at f-stop 4 performs even better, way better than the 17 to 35 millimeter at f-stop 4. Unless you really need an f-stop of 2.8, you'd probably want to consider getting the 16 to 35 millimeter lens.
Now I'm going to talk about these two lenses in the field and which lens you should use for what type of photography. Now, in my opinion, although these have very similar ranges, they serve two completely different purposes. If you're a landscape photographer, there's no doubt that you'll want to get the 16 to 35 millimeter lens. You don't really need the speed of the 17 to 35 millimeter, and this lens is so much sharper in so many situations. It's just a much better performer in terms of image quality than the 17 to 35 millimeter lens. However, if you're into low light photography, especially nighttime photography, then you definitely want to consider getting the 17 to 35 millimeter lens, because it is a full stop faster for those types of situations. The only problem is you're going to have to give up some image quality in the corners. This lens does not perform nearly as well as this 16 to 35 millimeter lens does at larger f-stops. So you're going to have to take that in consideration. Are you willing to give up your image quality to have a faster lens? That's really up to you. If it were me personally, even if I did do low light photography, I would still get the 16 to 35 millimeter lens, simply because of how sharp it is. This lens at f-stop 4 is much sharper than the 17 to 35 millimeter at f-stop 4. But once again, that's a decision that you have to make. And this has been a comparison between the Nikon 17 to 35 millimeter lens and Nikon 16 to 35 millimeter lens.